I'm very glad to be joined here by David Goldblatt. So David Goldblatt is a sociologist, a historian, and a writer. Some of his books include The Ball is Round and The Game of Our Lives, which Professor David Runciman of Cambridge University said not just the best soccer book in many years, but an exemplary account of the changing character of British society in the post-Thatcher era. And his most recent book, Injury Time, focuses on the state of football in the modern day and its use as a lens for examining social change. So if any of you have listened to The Rest is History, Dominic Sandbrook said that he's possibly the best football historian there's ever been. And there's a few central kind of recurring theses across Mr. Goldblatt's work, and that's that football, although we have different languages, cultures, football, the rules are universal, and so it's a way of examining the world. Football is kind of a mirror and it's an engine of change, and so the evolution of football often parallels kind of broader societal transformations. But coming along with that, the globalization and commercialization of football and of the world is reflected within football. And so while football can unify people across class and region and national divides, it can also become a battleground for identity, belonging, and power. So today, over the next half hour, I'll be asking some questions, and then we'll go to a Q&A from the audience. And we're going to be focusing on the fact that from its working class origins, football has grown since the founding of the Premier League in 1992 to a global industry which, if we just measure it by total revenue, is the 57th largest economy in the world. So we're going to be focusing on the relationship between football and how it mirrors wider changes in the world. I'd like to big thank you to Ben Keeling and to Keen there for helping me write these questions. Their knowledge of football is great in depth, and they really made sure they're great questions. And while we're speaking, you think about what you'd like to ask. That'd be great. And so the first question I'd like to ask you is that why do you think football has such a hold on British culture and global culture in general?
Well, one of the amazing things I think about football is when I watch the FA Cup final. I think this is 150 years we've been doing this. How many things in British society remain central to our cultural life that actually date to the mid-Victorian era? This has been around a very long time. So I think just longevity and perseverance counts for a lot. I think it's also that football has become probably the most important form of collective storytelling in modern British society. I mean, it used to be that politicians and intellectuals even used to devise forms of public conversation and public imagery and public narratives, but no one's listening to those dudes anymore, or they're just coming up with conspiracy theory, or in the case of the Labour Party, have kind of abandoned meaningful storytelling altogether. And football has an extraordinary capacity, I think, to do that. And it's incredibly embedded in British society. I mean, there are 1.4 million people who regularly volunteer in some capacity in football, be it, driving people to games or refereeing. 1.4 million. That's probably 10 times the number that are volunteering for the Scouts and the Guides. So Baden-Powell, who absolutely hated football, is thankfully turning in his grave on that. But it's not just that, it's the number of people who are playing. We now have a situation where probably more people are playing football regularly in some form or another than at any point. Now that women and girls are playing football in historically unprecedented numbers, the fastest growing sport in the country by a long way, just the sheer number of people engaging at that level. Or you look at the number of referees. There are more referees in this country than there are magistrates and judges. There are more coaches in this country than there are primary school teachers. So it's absolutely in the warp and weft of everyday life in this country. And it is, I would say, probably now the most popular form of popular culture. Music, which certainly when I was younger would have, occupied a lot more space, is so fragmented, so divided, and football is so much more public. I mean, so much music has sort of disappeared into people's earbuds, and football's kind of out there, this extraordinary kind of public theatre. So I think on all of those levels, I mean, I think the other thing I suppose I would say is, when we say football and we think obviously about people playing it, I think football is probably best understood as a soap opera. Each week, there's multiple characters interacting. There's a cliffhanger every week, like, will we be better? Will we be worse? Who will be top of the table? And in the same way that soap opera at its peak, in the 70s and 80s, was the space in which politics with a small p was being discussed or shown on the screen. And now soap opera has pretty much disappeared. By comparison, I thought a really good example of how football now occupies that space that soap opera once occupied is that in 2001, the BBC were doing a 45-minute special of EastEnders where the person who shot Grant Mitchell was going to be revealed. I don't know if that's on your radar, but anyway, it was a big deal in 2001. So they write to ITV and UEFA saying, look, you've got a kick-off for Liverpool versus Atletico Madrid on Tuesday evening, right, at 8 o'clock, but we're showing EastEnders till 8:15. Would you mind kicking off 15 minutes earlier? And unbelievably, ITV and UEFA went, yeah, no problem, we'll kick off 15 minutes later. You then fast forward to 2022, the Qatar World Cup, and soap operas are completely removed from the broadcast schedule. You can only find them on ITVX and iPlayer because the football completely occupies the space that would have normally been in the slots for soap opera. So football is a soap opera. It is also a form of public theatre, with an audience that actually believes that it is the chorus, the commentator, a participant, and we are now seeing, I calculate that last year more people went to see professional football than has ever happened in this country. Previously, the peak was 1951. After the Second World War, there's fuck all to do. No one's got any money. The only interesting thing going on is football. So the numbers go crazy. And then there is a long and almost unbroken decline for about 35 years after that. And since then, 1985 is the nadir, it's been going up and up. And now that we have professional women's football as well, the numbers are the greatest we have ever seen. So it's a form of public theatre, it's a form of soap opera, it's a form of personal ritual and collective ritual. In a society which has fewer and fewer collective rituals and fewer collective spaces in which that can be experienced. Football's doing all of them. So it's kind of no wonder that it's at the heart of the culture.
That's really interesting that you'd say football is a collective ritual, but obviously that ritual's changed over time. And I like that you pointed to 1985 as an nadir, because in that time, especially in 150 years of footballing history, it began as a very localized working class sport where people would go out and support their local teams. And it's turned into a multi-billion pound industry, one of the big things driving the British economy. And so within that, we've also seen the transformation of footballers themselves from individuals. I'm doing some research for this. So when Britain won the World Cup, they didn't get paid.
England.
Sorry. That's
the Scots in the audience, right?
But they went from being, working class people playing football, so now they're A-list celebrities. And so people like Pele, Maradona, and David Beckham who are coming through the ranks and are becoming global superstars. So can you explain how football changed from its roots into this multi-billion pound industry?
So one thing, that narrative is true, but it forgets the fact that football is originally actually an upper-class boys' cult. Football in its modern form is reinvented inside the public schools between 1840 and 1860. So when the FA was founded in 1863 and the rules that we now play by are first written down, everyone's been to Oxford or Cambridge. They're all going to go on and run the empire. They've all come from Westminster and Eton and Harrow and so on. And the working class takeover of football only really happens in the late 1870s and 1880s, but boy, does it happen fast. Because, as indeed with women's football, it's like once people get the chance to play football, They can't get enough, and it was the same with working class men and working class boys in the 1870s and 1880s. So fast forward to, how and why has it changed? 1985 is a really interesting moment. 1985 is the moment which we have the lowest post-war figures for attendance. It's been declining from 41 million over the season to like 25 million by 1985. And in 1985 is not a good year for English football. It's not a good advertisement for English football. You have the Bradford fire, in which 56 people die at Bradford City when a 19th century wooden stadium goes up in flames because someone flicks a fag down and there's 100 years of accumulated rubbish underneath and a whoosh. So that's bad. Then you've got the sixth round FA Cup final, sixth round of the FA Cup match between Millwall and Luton that is shown at prime tea time on a Saturday afternoon on BBC One that terminates in the most unbelievable riot in which thousands of Millwall fans basically are fighting police dogs and fighting police horses. I mean, they're at 5:45, the generation game with Bruce Forsyth is about to go on, and you've got some dude from Millwall literally punching a police dog on primetime television. Not a good advert for football, right? And then the Heysel disaster, the European Cup final in Belgium, Juventus versus Liverpool. A group of Liverpool fans make a charge across this very ancient and decrepit stadium. The Italians retreat to a wall. The wall collapses. 39 people are dead. They still play the game. You would think, given 35 years of decline and then that kind of advertising in 1985, it's like football's all over, right? The Sunday Times in its leader column describes football as a slum game played by slum people in slum stadiums. And then what happens in 1986? The numbers go up. And then in 1987, the numbers go up. And in 1988, and this is before the Premier League, right? So a lot of people would argue that the revival of football is down to the Premier League, more money, all-seater stadiums, etc., etc. But there are 7 years before the Premier League is established where the numbers go up. And as a sociologist, you have to look at this and go, something powerful is going on. After a 30-year literally unbroken decline, suddenly the graph turns upwards. So what's going on? And what's going on, I mean, it's a complicated question, but two key other things happen in 1985 and 1986. Number one is the end of the miners' strike. And that's the moment my own personal recollection from the time is we all kind of knew this is the end of industrial working class England. I mean, it had been coming. Deindustrialisation has been coming. Thatcher's been beating the hell out of the social democratic settlement. We can see what's coming, but we knew when the miners' strike was over, something was lost and it was never coming back. And I think that's a lot of what the return to football was about, is a sense that old industrial working class England, for good or ill, is over. And we're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because there was a lot about that world, it was racist and it was sexist, and it was stiflingly conservative, as everything in English society was. But it was also solidaristic, egalitarian, rooted in tradition, a kind of collective entity. And I think there was a real sense that if you want that, where are you going to find that? You're going to find it in English football, one of the last spaces in which large numbers of people to gather, with a shared collective identity and purpose. And then the other thing that happens is that MDMA shows up. And so all of the energies, and people, you may well know this, but for a long time, acid house and rave culture would be understood. The popular narrative is that this is a middle-class southern phenomenon, imported from Ibiza. MDMA comes and arrives, and off it goes. But of course it was a working class phenomenon, because where are all the empty factories? Where are the empty warehouses in 1985 in which to have a rave? They're in Blackburn, they're in Preston, all the places that are getting destroyed. And that's actually where much of the rave culture was. So I think many of the energies in working class youth culture that have previously sought the adrenaline kick, of a fight and of action at the football stadium. It's like, oh, well, we could do that, or we could take ecstasy and dance our tits off all night. And a lot of people, that's where it all goes. So the whole kind of vibe becomes much less aggressive, I would say, from 1985 onwards. So the combination of diminishing levels of really rampant hooliganism and a return to a sort of romantic return to social democratic England is what's going on. And that, as I say, we look back at, where else can you experience the past the way that you can at football, where it really is connected to stuff that happened 50, 60, 70 years ago, I mean, the language, I'll finish this, but one way of thinking or recognising that is, as you know, if you ever listen to Football Chat, we're always talking about footballers' wages, all right? Oh, he's on £25,000 a week, or a lot more actually these days. And I think, wages? What are you on about? Erling Haaland is not earning a wage, he's on a salary, right? Being paid into his bank account, right? We're pretending that it's 1952 in West Bromwich and we're getting 10 bob notes in a brown envelope on a Friday afternoon, right? And it's that romantic, it's like the lads. I mean, we're talking about people from Senegal, we're talking about people from France, from Argentina. They're not the lads. This is like, what fantasy are we living here? Similarly, what is it that what's the nickname for the manager? The gaffer, all right? Have you ever wondered, actually, like, what's a gaffer? So the gaffer, certainly in my youth, they're not the foreman, they're the person just below the foreman on the building site, basically, who rallies the troops. And it's like, Arsene Wenger's on a building site in Camden in 1970. This is like a multitasking post-industrial manager. But we have this fantasy that it's still 1951. And I think we are, what the next generation thinks, I don't know. But the generation that has made the Premier League and has been going for the last 25, 30 years is in romantic connection with an imagined English past. So I think all of those things, that's what took people back. And then the Premier League arrives. And of course it gets better. It's worth remembering, though, for the first 5 years of the Premier League, it didn't look like it does now. I was watching a selection. Have any of you heard of Mickey Quinn? Mickey Quinn was a very fat forward who played for Coventry City. They used to sing, he's fat, he's round, he's worth £1 million, Mickey Quinn. I mean, he'd never get on the pitch these days, honestly. He's got like a gut like you can't believe. Anyway, I watched somebody, thank God people do this on YouTube, who put together all 49 goals that he scored for Coventry over 3 seasons at the beginning of the Premier League. And I'm watching it, I'm going, this doesn't look like football today. This is the football of the 1970s. The stadiums, okay, they're, you can't stand, but, they're all completely decrepit. The pitch is still incredibly muddy, not like today's kind of, billiard tables. It looks like the 1970s and 1980s. So it took some time, but of course, within 5 years, once Sky really upped the money, I remember the day Ravanelli arrived at Middlesbrough. I thought, what? Ravanelli? This is one of the Italian greats. He's been playing for Juventus for the last 5 years. He's going to Middlesbrough? Something is profound is happening in the economics of English football. And of course, on we go. And, that is part of the attraction. The world's talent has been gathered pretty much into one place. But I think the really core thing for understanding the rise of football over the last 30 years is actually a romantic relationship with the past. In the game of our lives, I describe English football as a social democratic game in a neoliberal world. And I think that is where the kind of main energies have come. The future, that how long that will remain true, how long those sorts of ideas and imagery will still be important to people, is different. People have lived through something different now, but that's definitely the roots.
So to talk about that neoliberal turn as the kind of romantic past fades out. So we've seen some moves towards that recently. So I think the big thing, obviously, of the last few years was the creation of the Super League, when to maximise profits, it was basically going to shut out the possibility of relegation. The other thing that I'm very grateful to Ben for this as an example, the increasing relocation of games outside of domestic countries to pull in a bigger fan audience. So Villarreal versus Barcelona, so they moved the match to Miami so they could get American money, basically, and American asses and seats. And they ended up cancelling it due to poor planning. But this is obviously like the fabric of the game is changing from a profit-seeking motive. So how is that developed, and how do you see that developing?
Okay, so the key thing here is that football does not make a profit. The Premier League has been going for 33 seasons. In only 4 of those seasons has it collectively made a profit. It has made a loss over that period of more than £20 billion. The Premier League loses money. It loses money like nobody's business. It's got a £7.5 billion annual turnover. It is currently £11.5 billion in debt. All right. So no, it's not making any money. That's the incredible thing. And nobody if you want to make money, don't buy a football club. Buy shares in Apple. Buy shares in Meta. Right. That's what's going to make you money. You know, and you think, why are people buying football clubs? You know, did Roman Abramovich buy Chelsea to make money? The man already had £11.2 billion from stealing it from the Russian people, right? Buying Chelsea is a political move. How do I get myself out of Russia? How do I get my money out of Russia? Nobody in the world knows who I am, so I need some covering fire if I'm to escape Putin's wrath. I know, I'll buy a football club. That's what he does, and he drops. I mean, he lost $2.5 billion while he owned Chelsea, or the UAE, right, who own Manchester City, or Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia does not need to make money out of Newcastle United, right? It's just like, that's madness, you know. And again, the rich Americans, okay, a few of them, you know, maintain the fantasy that somehow in the future maybe it'll be like an American sport where you have enough internal regulation to allow owners to earn some money. But there's no sign of that whatsoever. I mean, as Alan Sugar, when he was at Tottenham, described the economics of football, he said it's the prune juice effect. Goes in one end, straight out the other. Because the currency is not profit. The currency is status. The currency is soft power. The currency is vanity. It is self-importance. And, you know, for many of the new owners, the only way I can understand it is, you know, this is a way of dealing with the ennui and alienation of the super rich. You know, why are Americans buying Ipswich or Huddersfield? This is not going to make you any money, but if you want to play Lord of the Manor, if you want to be the custodian of a valuable cultural object, if you want to buy your way into a community because you have no community, football offers that possibility. So while on the one hand it is super commercialized and there is an endless drive to produce more and more revenue, which explains the things that you're talking about, the desire to have matches overseas, build a global audience, it is not about profit. It's not. I mean, put it this way. OnlyFans, we're all familiar with the website OnlyFans. Okay, they have paid more corporation tax in the last 5 years than the entirety of English football. That gives you a measure of kind of mad economics. The only other way in which it is, you know, people make money out of it is treating football as a speculative asset. So, okay, when Abramovich bought Chelsea, it was worth, he paid like 30 million quid and took on 300 million quid of debt, right? And now then they sold it to Ted Boley and the other billionaires for like 1.5 billion. So as a speculative asset, you can make money. But as a day-to-day operation, because everybody in the end in football, right, even the uber capitalists, it's like, we want to beat Brighton next week. Maybe if we buy another left back, that will sort it out. Yeah, 100 million, no problem. That's how people think. I mean, Sepp Blatter, who you all know was once the president of FIFA, who I rarely agree with, but he did say this. He said, football makes people mad. And that's what it does to the super rich as well. They cannot get enough because the currency is not profit.
Excellent, thank you. So it's just gone past, so I want to make sure there's enough time for questions. I'll ask one more so everyone think about anything you'd like to ask. So for my final question, so football creates community, but it's also used by a lot of people to divide communities, and as I don't have to list examples, I'm sure we can all think of many. We just have to go back to the last Euros. But or the 2018 Euro, sorry. But how do you see football's role in creating community and being used by actors to divide people in the future? And is there stuff we in the room can do to fight that?
It's a huge question. So where do I begin? I think one of the most interesting examples of both the potential of football to divide and its resistance to that is the way that Reform and the right-wing populists have been playing with football. They love to get in there. I noticed Farage has let it be known that he's a Crystal Palace fan. Ha ha ha. I don't think we don't actually believe that. But he feels the need that he has to say that. And they had a press conference earlier this year with Reform football shirts with like Tice, Farage, etc. on the backs of the shirts. So they would love to occupy that space, as indeed the far right did in the 70s and 80s when the National Front and the BNP were trying to recruit muscle on the terraces. That strategy is not quite what they're there for. But yeah, a good example of how the attempt to divide, I suppose, is, you may remember before the last Euros, the England team had a slightly changed St George's cross, very small on their shirts, in purple. And this was taken as an opportunity to say, football, this is outrageous, this is unpatriotic. And Starmer came out and agreed. And it was so great that football bounced back and refused to take that on. People were saying, I was all over football Twitter, people going, oh, right. You're the dude from UKIP who had a purple Union Jack as your symbol with a yellow circle with a pound sign in the middle that made it look like, a cheap supermarket kind of white bread wrapper, like, and you think this is a place that you could make that argument? Or, another way of thinking about it is the Euro 2020. Again, you may recall 3 black players on the England team missed penalties in the shootout, right? And of course, everyone's freaking out, going, this is going to be very bad on social media. There's going to be a big racist backlash. And so there was. But what was so extraordinary about it is the amount of love and support that those players then all, Marcus Rashford's mural in Wythenshawe was defaced by some racist fucker. And then literally 20,000 people showed up with post-it notes of love that they stuck all over it. I thought it was also interesting that in the past, white players would not have come out and supported their black peers, but you had the whole England team, Harry Kane, absolutely out there. So football is a space in which all of our social conflicts, are on display, and that's kind of what makes it so extraordinary. And particularly on the issue of race, because most white people don't actually see racism. They go, like, there's racism? I don't actually see any of it. It's like, but you can't avoid it. When somebody's screaming in Raheem Sterling's face from the kind of touchline, it's like, there it is, people. This is who and what we are. You can't not see it. So it's amazing public theatre, and it provides space for the racists and those who want to divide. It also becomes a space in which anti-racism is in a way more visible than in any other cultural realm in the country. I find that, that's what gives me hope about football, is that it's got both of these things going on, and we as a society have a kind of choice, about who we are, which side we're on. But it forces us in that way to take sides, and I think that's a very powerful and valuable sort of political function. It's the same with women's football. There's no shortage of misogyny and sexism in this country, we all know. But it's such a thing for women's football now to be, on the BBC on prime time. The celebration at Trafalgar Square. What an incredible, and I'll finish on this note, just how football can create new kinds of unity and community, is that I went to see the England women win the Euros in 2022 at Wembley. And they're playing Germany. And if I'd been at a men's match, which I have been, the air would have been full of 10 German bombers in the air, 2 World Wars and 1 World Cup, right? Except they've all been the Second World War. Not a fucking thing. Not a single reference to the Second World War. Longer queues for water than there were for beer. And I was walking up Wembley Way with my partner, and suddenly someone started shouting, David Goldblatt. I'm thinking, what? I turn around, this woman's picked up my bank card, all right, and is holding it up to give my bank card back. If that happened at the men's game, that's at Tesco's buying alcohol on contactless immediately. But most amazing of all, at the end, England win, we're all cheering, and there's my partner Sarah, who, she likes to fall asleep to Match of the Day. She likes to watch the World Cup and so on. The rest of the time she doesn't give a fuck about football. And she's punching the air, she's going, we won. I said, we? And she said, yeah, I finally feel like part of the we. I thought, how amazing. A different version of the English nation. And it can be the English, the militarist, xenophobic, reactionary version. And then it can be this other amazing version of the English nation as well. And I don't know anywhere in English culture at the moment where that's going on. And that's what makes, for me, football so endlessly interesting, but such an interesting space for political intervention as well.
Well, thank you very much. I think, first of all, a huge round of applause. So now we'll go to questions from the audience. We've got one over there. I'll pass you my microphone as well, if you wouldn't mind speaking into that.
Hi, David. Thank you for the talk. That was really lovely to hear, and something I think everyone can resonate with in the way that we view football. I was just wondering what you think about how we can return to football being a community building social realm in the idea of like small towns and villages, because obviously back in the day you'd have a little football team for each town in like satellite towns around cities and the rural areas, and the whole town would gather and watch. And I think it's really lovely how you've talked about how we can now rally around big teams. The terraces like Old Trafford and Arsenal 30, 40 years ago would have been completely different looking to the way they are now.
Yeah.
And Wembley nonetheless. But when it comes to smaller teams shutting down, even from like tier 3 onwards, you get teams folding every other week. You got Sheffield Wednesday now. And once you got lower than that, your local town team will often be, the stadium's in disrepair, townspeople aren't turning up anymore, no one really knows what the score is. Do you think there's a way that football can, at least English football in the way that I understand it, can recover that sense of all of the smaller townspeople using it as a realm to gather and come together around one specific, goal for your town to win?
I mean, there is definitely a narrative in English football that sort of parallels the conversations we had after Brexit about, a global metropolitan city-based elite that's connected to the world, that reaps all the benefits, and, what's happened to Preston and Blackpool. There is some truth in that, and as a metaphor, it's brilliant. But the reality actually in lower league football and small town football is not as depressing, I think, as you suggest. The numbers of people, I was saying, it's record levels of attendance, and that's not just at the Premier League. We're talking down in, the Championship is now the 5th most attended league in all of Europe. More people go and watch the Championship, the second level of English football, than the top level in France, for example. And League One, the third level, is the 10th most popular in terms of attendance league in all of Europe, which is like, really, that's like Bristol Rovers territory. And still to this day, I mean, my local club, Tottenham are my first love, inherited from my father and grandfather, but I've lived in Bristol for nearly 25 years. Bristol Rovers are my local squeeze, and they're shit. And there's 8,000 people showing up paying good money every week. 8,000 people. And now if you go down into the National League, to Forest Green Rovers and Altrincham and like Dorking, we're also talking record levels of attendance. So I don't think, in a way, people are desperate for forms of collective association. We've done 40 years of social fragmentation and meaningless and pointless individual overconsumption. And somewhere deep in the soul of the country, most folks are going, this is really unsatisfying. Actually, I'm looking for something else. And, football's that space. I mean, particularly in a very secular society like our own. So I think there is a question about, is there a way of making English football's economics more equitable and finding ways that less money is at the top and more money is at the bottom? I think there's an argument to be had about how the grassroots funded, because that's actually really where the most powerful forms of local social association, are being made. And there, I mean, people often say, the Premier League should be paying up more. And there's some truth in that. But the real problem is local government here. I mean, the reason that grassroots and lower level football is struggling in this country, particularly in terms of its infrastructure, is that local government has had a 40% cut over the last 15 years under austerity. And much as everyone would like to fund football stadiums, there's a social care crisis going on, and all of the other things you have to spend money on. And there's literally no money left, for grassroots pitches. So there's a bigger kind of question going on there. And again, I think what we're seeing in football, I mean, I began to look at this in my most recent book, is that the old version of football, which is, 11-a-side on a full-size pitch with an FA-affiliated club as the model, is diminishing. But there are lots of other forms of association, so it's the small-sided game. We have disability football in this country at a level that we haven't had ever. I mean, the FA and the whole football culture, if you were disabled, it's like, see you fucking later, you can have a wheelchair seat if you're lucky. Or those extraordinary scenes in the 1970s when I don't know if you've ever seen the pictures of those three-wheeled blue mobility cars that were dished out to veterans in the post-war era. That was a whole thing. They were absolutely lethal vehicles. And you used to be able to park them basically behind the goal at Anfield. There'd be a whole line of them. And that was as far as disability football went. Now, that's going, or walking football. Have you come across walking football? I'm getting nods. So, from nowhere, there are now 250,000 people regularly playing walking football, which for older gentlemen like myself is an absolute godsend, let me tell you, because it allows me to play football without risking, destroying my pelvis. And of course, women playing football now in absolutely unprecedented numbers. So I think the associational side of football at the lower levels is richer than you imagine. That said, there's a certain soullessness, in the experience of league football. I mean, when I go and see Tottenham, for example, I do feel quite alienated. I'm in a $1 billion stadium in one of the poorest parts of the country that feels like sealed off like a wall from everything else. And, sad sociologist that I am, I always do an ethnicity and gender check when I'm in a football stadium, and I'll go, okay, I'm just going to count everybody in this space, and it's definitely not the demography of Tottenham or Haringey in there. So, and more and more tourists and all of that. So there is a lack of soul at the top, but I would say actually down at the grassroots and in lower league football, there are some really exciting energies. And increasing, we're seeing more, fan ownership, fan involvement, clubs that are being set up with a very clear kind of ideological and social agenda. And you think about COVID, where football clubs, turn themselves into food delivery services. And, David Moyes is delivering vegetable boxes, around Merseyside. And there was a lot of that. So while I totally hear what you're saying, and there are problems at the top, there's a real richness down below. Does it need help? I mean, in terms of wider public spending and infrastructure, yes. And there are plenty of problems with grassroots football. Let's not, have rose-tinted spectacles here. I could go on about the treatment of referees in grassroots football, which is really not pretty. But it's remarkable in such an individualized age how much people are, this is a space people feel that they can go to. I think there's something really powerful there that we have only begun to scratch the surface of. I think, you could see Starmer was trying to play on that. I mean, during the last election campaign, he held press conferences at 14 football clubs. 14, like no one's ever done. You know, Harold Wilson may have shown up for the World Cup, you know, celebration after 66, but he wasn't holding press conferences, you know, at Aldershot or indeed Bristol Rovers. So I think there's a recognition what a powerful thing it is. I mean, above all, the thing is, like, get involved, set up your football club, join your supporters' trust, you know, demand change in the club that you're part of. I mean, that's the weak link, is turning that communality and sociability and solidarity actually into political action. But that could be said of pretty much everything in England these days.
Do you have any other questions? Yep.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. So my team's Dagenham and Redbridge. And you spoke, I was following on slightly from that question. We had an Egyptian YouTuber want to invest in our club last season. It lasted like 3 weeks because of backlash from supporters. And it was the craziest fans forum I've been to, where Israel and Gaza sort of dominated the whole conversation, which Dagenham...
So what dominated the conversation?
Like the Israel and Gaza sort of...
Right.
Because it turned out that one of the investors had made a pro-Hamas video, so they had to put out of the funding for the club. They created such division amongst the fan base, and people were bringing Israel flags to the next home game. And it was things like, and they set up like Israeli daggers sort of fan account and stuff. And there's things like that which never would have happened 10 years ago. And I think it was just, yeah, it was very mind-blowing. It sort of speaks to how like globalization's worked. So like effectively in that way. But also, I just want to get to the point of, so we're now in National League South. So I think someone said today that to run our club, you're, like you said, you're losing like 800k, £1 million a year. There's no real financial investment, but do you think that speaks to how the traction of English football nowadays across the world is so big that you'd come to a 7th tier club to want to say that you're owning an English football team?
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, Wrexham's part of the problem with that. I mean, they'd be coming anyway, but now Americans in particular, and I do say Americans because we think, you know, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Abramovich, the vast majority of foreign owners are Americans. Sometimes as individuals, sometimes as hedge funds, sometimes as private equity. They now own a majority of Premier League clubs, probably half of the Championship, but a big chunk of Leagues 1 and Leagues 2 as well. And as you say, now people are looking for, you know, easier pickings in the National League down 5th, 6th, 7th level. So that is, you know, what can be done about that? Because they're the people who are prepared to drop 800,000 a year, because particularly in the US, given A, the scale of economic growth, and B, its grotesque inequalities. There's a lot of really rich people in America, you know, people who've got 100 million, 200 million, and then you can afford to play, and you can afford to drop £1 million every year because it's like, it's pocket money for you. So what's to be done about that? I mean, I actually think just nobody should, private ownership is wrong in football. It's not just Americans. I mean, you know, I don't want Joe Lewis and his family to own Tottenham Hotspurs. You know, English oligarchs are just as bad as everybody else. And I really think that football clubs should be socially owned. You know, what is a football club? You know, it's not its infrastructure, it's not its players, it's not the coach, it's not the owners. It's the collective accumulated cultural capital and memory of generations of fans who have interacted with the club and turned it, you know. Otherwise, it is actually just a ball in the back of the net and no one cares. It's the fact that we choose collectively to make it significant. So I would say part of the response that this needs to be, we need social ownership. And the Germans do it. You know, most of the German clubs are collectively owned, you know, with a democratic structure for electing their boards. And, you know, they seem to do okay. They win the World Cup quite a lot, so that doesn't seem to be a problem. I actually think we should have a transaction tax on football clubs, where a percentage of every year's revenue is put in a fund that then is basically buys the shares off the owners and transfers them to the fans. I mean, this was the Meidner plan in Sweden in the 70s, where corporate pensions were basically going to be run by trade unions to buy the companies that workers work for and affect a transition to social ownership. I see no reason why we shouldn't do that here. I mean, at the very least, states should not be allowed to own football clubs. Like, let's start there. But I think we need that, and I think we need different kinds of financial controls. You know, as I was saying earlier, people are obsessed. People want to win. People want glory. That's the currency. So that's hopeless for, you know, sensible household accounting. And I think we need to be, again, like the Germans. In Germany, in the top 4 levels, you have to have an audit and present your budget to the Bundesliga before you can play. And the Bundesliga goes, oh, you seem to be planning a £3 million deficit this year. You have to actually have a different budget or you can't play. I mean, it's that simple. They say, you want to run a £3 million deficit? Go play somewhere else. You're not in the Bundesliga. So that's a massive pressure for everybody to basically, you know, rein in the mad wages and the main transfers. And I think now with the independent football regulator, I see no reason why that, you know, this is a matter of political will. So I think at that point, if you can produce those legislative changes, big if, but nonetheless, if you could do that, you could see a transition to socially owned and economically sustainable football clubs. But, you know, it's a bit like the money lenders need to be kicked out of the temple, because that's kind of where we are.
You have a question up front, and then we'll take the one at the back for our last question.
Yeah, thank you. I think people would expect me to talk about Rangers and Celtic, and I think it is a brilliant example of sociology in football and how that can be unpacked. But I think what's kind of what really interests me, what you're saying and what comes out in the discussion is this kind of what I think of as quite an interesting contradiction between the sort of fetish of the small community and the insular community, and then these beautiful moments, I think, of solidarity that are shown across clubs, across the nation. And I think there's interesting moments of women's football that also show this, and I think that's the last bit of the question I want to ask. But I think some of the things that are interesting that I think I found interesting, particularly in how discussions around English football tend to happen, is being really exemplified once again by the discourse around the selection process of the World Cup team, and particularly how Bellingham is being talked about by the English press, and how the English press has historically talked about not just players but specifically black players. And I think it's shocking that Ian Wright has had to come out and say again what he's had to say every single time that this happens about how black players are treated. But I think the brilliant thing is how that is then treated by fans, not just of Bellingham, people who might hate Real Madrid, people who might hate England, for instance, as many Scottish fans often do in a slightly one-sided and stupid historical beef that we have, is this sort of like international support of Bellingham and of English players, particularly Saka and Rashford at the last Euros. And I think there's a bit of a problem with how we then sort of discuss how to improve football. I think the more solidarity, such as when the English players came out in solidarity with the women's football team in Spain when they were abused and went on strike in order to kick their coach out, which I think had a slightly disastrous end to it and never really solved that problem of misogyny within such an interesting team. These moments of solidarity, I think, should be the central focus. How does international and internal solidarity function in a system of small community insularity, which isn't a problem inherently, I don't think, but I think has to be balanced. And if it's not balanced, then these problems will go on to re-replicate themselves. Because as you mentioned, that social democracy was not without its flaws. That sort of image, that romantic image of what football could be, isn't going to be solved by returning to the 50s at all. It's not going to solve the social problems in football. I think women's football is kind of at that, like, microcosm, because there isn't that necessarily that past. You know, a lot of people will talk about the time of the First World War and how women's football sort of spikes then, but there isn't a strong legacy, and I think there's an attempt to inject both that kind of sort of fragmentation that has existed in the men's game into the women's game. And also because of that, I think a rise in racist attacks, certainly a rise in racist attacks online to players. And I think there's a sort of, not, for me at least, a lack of clarity about actually how do we solve this problem. Does the women's game need more money? Does it need to take a sort of German approach and actually change what football could possibly be? And I think there's a sort of opportunity for women's football to demonstrate what a modern game of football actually looks like in a way that actually, and there's a problem that I don't think that's going to happen, and I don't know if you think that could happen potentially.
It's a really, really interesting area of debate, because there is part of the conversation sometimes seems to be, without people saying it, how can we make women's football more like men's football, i.e., with more money and with more tribal aggression. And I should say, I quite like the tribal aggression sometimes in men's football. That's part of actually the edge of it, is kind of what makes it interesting. But I also think there are lots and lots of ways of doing football. And what's so interesting about the way women's football has evolved in this country over the last 30 years is to create a really different fan and playing culture. And you go to Arsenal, 60,000 people at the Emirates, but, it's like more women than you'd ever see at any other stadium. Very, very openly queer, which is an amazing, in a way that you just never see at men's football, in terms of who's there, how they're dressed, how they're behaving with each other, how they're treated. And I think that's really, this is what we want to preserve. I mean, I also like the fact that at women's football, there is less edge. The fans are not segregated. And I've actually been at a women's football match where people started chanting, who the fucking hell are you? And there was a real hold on, this is language that we don't do. What's her name? Lottie for Arsenal.
Lots of women more.
Yeah, she was giving it this to the crowd, whereas normally at men's football you'd be giving it that. And I just thought that's a really interesting and different way of doing football sport. I think we're at a sort of interesting moment. It could be, and I think the smart thing is that difference will be retained, nurtured, and developed, because it provides something different. I mean, if you want edge and aggression, you can go and watch men's football, and if you want something a bit more relaxed, and inclusive, you can go to women's football. My main concern with that is less the fan culture and more the money, because the way the money is going in women's football in this country is we're going down the route of the Premier League, where all of the clubs are losing money, where you've got masses of, owner loans that will never be paid back, which means that only 3 or 4 clubs are competitive. There's no forms of financial control. Everyone's in debt. So I think that's where I would be focusing my energies, at least in part, is to say, let's change the economic model, and let's let that culture develop. I mean, I see increasingly in terms of podcasts, magazines, other forms of saying, there's a really interesting and different kind of women's football fan culture. Are you familiar, I'm sure you are, with the magazine Girl Fans? Okay, what a brilliant thing. What a brilliant thing, it's an Instagram thing, but it also produces magazines, and its whole thing is women fans, and with a focus on dress. And thank God, because, male football culture are literally the worst dressed people in the world. A great sea of unironed, inattentive masculinity in really bad, ill-fitting jeans. And, all the blood, I mean, I've got to just say, really, gentlemen of my age certainly should not be wearing replica kits. It's not dignified. It's not doing you any favours, guys. And as the cuts get more and more kind of it's really not a good look. Whereas women are dressing up, both for men's football and for women's football, and bringing, I mean, that was one good thing about the hooligan era, is there was a sense of style. You dressed up to go to the football. You look sharp, right? And I look around, I mean, at Bristol Rovers, it's we're literally the worst dressed people in the universe. This is not stylish. And one last thought on that is, again, just a personal thing, why I hope women's football holds on to its current model is, my son is gay and knew he was gay from the age of 2, when he basically discovered women's high heels and handbags, and it's he never let go. And I took him to his first football game when he was about 3 or 4, and I could see he just wasn't having it. He wasn't comfortable. He fell asleep actually, and never went to football. And of course, he recognised, oh my God, this is a hotbed of homophobia. And I took him to the 2019 Women's World Cup in Paris, and he just, what a different, he was like, oh, I can be okay here. This is a safe space. And he was able to enjoy all the things that are enjoyable about football without feeling that. So that's a really, I'm not sure that's ever happening in men's football, but it definitely is there in women's football. That's a really precious resource. So I suppose in answer to your question is, women's football does need more money, but does it need to be so ruthlessly and glibly commercialised in the way that men's football has? Does it have to have the kind of mad, performative, invented tribalism of men's football superimposed on it? There are lots of ways of having fun and experiencing a collective identity and indeed collective ecstasy at football. It doesn't have to be that way. I mean, what I would say is it needs people like you, of course, to actually be running the Football Association, Scottish or English. You need a different generation of people to actually be in charge. So that would be, and I think that was sort of my, what can we do is like, you guys, should you choose to, of future, and there is space now for different kinds of voices in the football industry, but it needs folks like you who love football but come from a different generation with different political and social attitudes, to be it. Otherwise it all ends up being fucking Rupert Lowe, who we know used to run Southampton, scumbag that he was. So yeah, what I'm saying is you need to be running the Scottish Football Association in 20 years.
So I know I said I'd take one more question from the back, but it's just turned 7 o'clock. I know some people we're supposed to go formal now. David's very grateful. He said he'll stay for another 15 minutes at the end of this. So what I would suggest is if people need to leave, if they leave in a second, otherwise I'd say get a drink, stick around 10, 15 more minutes. You can ask David some questions. And can I just say that was an absolutely incredible talk. If we get one more round.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Yeah, of course. No, I'm good. God, an hour just disappears.
No, it's crazy.
I thought we'd barely got started.